Okay, so next we're on to the student of Socrates, and really one of our preeminent philosophers this semester, and that is Plato. So Plato, again, is the student of Socrates and the teacher of Aristotle. And essentially, scholars struggled with dividing um, the ideas of Socrates from the ideas of Plato, because Plato writes all of the dialogues in which Socrates appears. So essentially, the split for us is going to be the ideas of Socrates are going to be those philosophical explorations that deal with the good life, ethical decision making, being a good person, virtue ethics, those sorts of things. We're going to dedicate those to Socrates, and then just about everything else is going to belong to Plato. So essentially what Plato does is he takes this fundamental idea from Socrates. Socrates believes that there is objective, permanent, unchanging truth when it comes to the good life, when it comes to being a good person. Plato takes this idea that truth is objective, and he creates a metaphysics from this basic assertion about truth. So here's just some background on Plato. Plato, in fact, not his real name. Plato is his wrestling name, maybe like Macho Man or something like that. Anyway, um, and so Plato is his seminal work, his long-standing contributions to philosophy have to do, or has to do, with his theory of forms. Right? And so his theory of forms, these are the justifications why anyone would put forth a theory of forms. So what exactly is his theory of forms? So this fundamental assumption that truth is permanent and unchanging and is objective and universal. If you look out at our reality and your position is that truth must be unchanging, one thing you'll notice about everything in our reality is that it is in fact changing. So from this, Plato understands that truth cannot be in this physical reality, that truth must be in some other reality, a reality where things are permanent and don't change. So he develops his theory of forms, which is a separate reality that you can have an understanding of, but you can't get to, say, with your physical body. You can't see it, you can't touch it, but you can understand it. So why would he ever come up with this theory of forms? And so here are four of the reasons why Plato believed that he was justified in positing this idea that there was a formal reality. And again, a form is simply the permanent, unchanging concept of things that we have in this world. So a computer, for instance, would have a form, right? And that the computer you're looking at is simply a copy of the original concept computer. Okay, well, as we go through it some more, it'll clarify, I promise. Okay. So why theory of forms? Number one, if truth is permanent, this is the only way that truth being permanent makes sense. It has to be in a separate reality. Number two, a theory of forms gives us some way to understand how and why humans are able to identify things. And we'll get a little more into that later. Number three, it explains how we understand fundamental concepts, like the ones in logic and math, for instance. So I'll give you an example. If I give you a fundamental rule of logic, that is the law of non-contradiction, and if you've never taken a logic class, if no one's ever educated you in the law of non-contradiction, you will still readily and absolutely understand this fundamental law. The law of non-contradiction is simply that a statement cannot be both true and false at the same time in the same way. Right? So the statement, I am sitting here right now, and the statement, I am not sitting here right now, cannot both be true at the same time. It either is or it isn't. And then you hear that, and even if you had no idea, you've never taken a logic class, that concept to you makes immediate sense. Well, of course we would say that's common sense. Well, what do we mean by common sense? Where does that come from? How do you fundamentally understand these things if you've never been introduced to them? And he says, okay, a theory of forms explains how we can understand those fundamental concepts. And then the last one, he says, okay, if Pythagoras says that, everything is based on math, all physical reality is basically mathematical principles at work, we can say that math supports physical reality, then, it's not too much more to say there's a whole nother reality that undergirds or supports this mathematical reality. Why not go one more, right? So that's why he believes formal reality to be, or his justification for taking the position that formal reality exists. Now, what is a form? As I said before, a form is the capital T truth of all the things in our reality. A form is something that's beyond the senses, but you can understand it, supersensible, yet intelligible. Also forms, they're permanent, they're objectively true, they never change. And formal reality, right, which is that plane of existence where forms are, it's hierarchical in nature. So there are higher and lower forms. The highest form for Plato is good, beauty, unity. And so there would be a form for student, right, which participates in other forms, but all forms, because it's hierarchical, participate in the highest form. And then each individual human has a permanent, unchanging truth about him or her, right? Not only do you participate in the form human or student, but you also have your own individual form. And for Plato, this is the human soul, that permanent, unchanging part of you. Now this image here is what's called the divided line. It's simply a way to explain how Plato understands formal reality. And at the end here, we'll get into his allegory of the cave and another way he has of conceiving of this reality. So essentially, this is the lowest point here. So these would be pictures, these would be paintings, right? These are representations of physical things. So when you get beyond that, and this is why Plato kicks all the painters out of his perfect society, because they're simply making a copy, right, of a form. So first you have pictures of things, then you have the things themselves, right? Then you have those mathematical formulas that undergird these things, and then eventually you have the forms, right? And the form is the highest truth, so to speak. That is the capital T truth, right? So your job for Plato is to work your way up this divided line using your intellect, using your rationality, using your ability to reason. Okay, so how to understand why he would argue for the existence of some permanent, unchanging concept for everything in this reality. So here's just one example. So if you look at this image, and this image, and that image, and that image, and that one, and that one, and that one, we are able to call all of these images by the same common name, chair. How is it possible that we can call this thing and this thing by the same name? Plato says if we were determining what made a thing what it is, and we used only those physical parts of the thing. Like, say we were just using the physical qualities of these things, would it be possible for us to call them by the same name? This is a chair, and this is a chair. Right? It would be impossible if we were just using the physical qualities of it. So Plato says, therefore, there must be some non-physical concept that we have an idea of, that we understand chairness, chairiosity. We understand the form chair. And because we understand it, we have an understanding of the form chair, we can call this and this and this chair. Okay, one more way to conceptualize or to understand the theory of forms is through the allegory of the cave. So what you have here, and in this image you have, a picture of the cave, but then here you have the divided line, or a part of the divided line down here, to sort of explain the progression. So the story goes that you have prisoners here, and so these prisoners are chained to the floor. They can't move, they can't turn around, they can't even turn their heads, right? These people are forced to stare at the back of this cave wall here, right? And behind these prisoners you have a wall, and then you have a road, and you have people walking up and down this road carrying stuff above their heads. Behind them a fire, and then here's the actual entrance to the cave. So the situation these prisoners find themselves in, year after year, generation after generation, is that they think the shadows that appear here are what's real. This is their reality, right? And again, they have no way of understanding or seeing the things that are behind them. So one day, a prisoner breaks free of his chains. He turns around, he sees the wall, he sees the people, he sees the fire, and he runs out of the cave. And finally, when he gets out of the cave, the sun's very bright, so he has to look at it. There's a little pond there, and he waits for his eyes to adjust to reality, right? How things actually are. And eventually he can actually, he can see the sun, his eyes adjust, etc. So he recognizes that, the fire that's in the cave is simply a copy of the sun, right? That the fire isn't the original light source, if you will. So he comes back in to tell all his friends that, hey, this isn't real. Those are just shadows. That's not the truth, right? The capital T truth is behind you out of the cave. And you can imagine, right, when the prisoners are being told that everything they believe to be true is not true, how they feel about that. And so, of course, they summarily kill the guy. But what it does a good job of, this allegory here, is not only to give you an idea of how Plato understands our place and what we think we know, but it really shows us how seriously we take threats to our understanding of how the world works. That, what would we be willing to do to preserve our understanding of what is real and true? And of course, this allegory is partly about Socrates as well, as when he attempted to tell the people of Athens that they were wrong. How did they reward Socrates for his help? They executed him. And lastly, we've talked about how in order to move up the divided line, to understand the forms, we have to utilize our rational minds, our ability to reason. And so Plato believed that our ability to reason, our human intellect, had to be in control at all times. And Plato conceived of the human soul, right? The parts, he thought of it as a tripartite soul, three parts to our soul. And he imagined it like a chariot or a charioteer, that you had two very strong horses in the front. You had will and passion, will being the driving force to action, and passion being our emotional selves. And he thought that the charioteer had to be reason, that reason and rationality had to be in control of those two very strong horses, that for him, he called that mental health. And if we didn't, if our chariot was not in harmony, that is, if reason was not in control, it would make it impossible for us to move up the divided line and actually have true knowledge of how things are. So for him, reason always had to be in control, and that's how we became successful. That's how we achieved our goal, which is understanding formal reality.